The wind hit her face like a slap, and Greta did not flinch. She stood in the mud of the street, her trunk at her feet, staring at the crooked sign that read Lucky Ram. Behind her, 3 men stopped what they were doing to watch. A woman fresh off the coach was always worth watching in Elk Hollow. A German woman, sent for by letter, was worth laughing at. "That's Bauer's Maylorder bride," one man muttered to another, grinning behind his hand. "Come all this way for that." Jonas stepped out from the saloon door, hat in his hands, his face red with shame. "Greta," he said, his voice cracking, "I should have told you. Business is bad, very bad." Greta did not answer him. She walked past him into the saloon, her boots loud on the old wood floor. Inside, dust hung in the air like fog. Cobwebs stretched across the corners. Chairs sat empty, their legs gray with neglect. On the bar sat one thing only, a loaf of bread, hard as a rock, forgotten weeks ago. She picked it up. The men who had followed her to the door leaned in, waiting to see her cry or scream or turn around and demand the next coach home. Jonas waited too, bracing himself. Instead, Greta knocked the loaf twice against the bar, hard like a judge's gavel. Then she laughed. It was not a small laugh. It rang out through the empty room, startling the dust itself. "You laugh," Jonas said, stunned. "This bread," Greta said, holding it high so all could see, "is an insult to flour." One of the men in the doorway snorted, despite himself. Another elbowed him to stay quiet. Greta turned the hard loaf over in her hands, studying it the way a doctor studies a wound. "Who baked this?" "No one," Jonas admitted. "It has sat there since summer." "Then tonight," Greta said, setting it down with a firm thud, "something new will be baked, and it will not be an insult." The men in the doorway exchanged looks. One of them, an old miner with a gray beard, shook his head slowly. "She thinks bread will fix this place," he whispered to his friend. "Lucky Ram's been dying 2 years. Woman doesn't know what she walked into." Jonas said nothing. He only watched his new wife roll up her sleeves, already moving toward the back room where the flour sat untouched, and he felt something he had not felt in a long time. He felt afraid to hope. Outside, the wind kept blowing dust down the empty street, same as it always had. But inside the Lucky Ram, for the first time in months, someone was not giving up the user wants outline 2 rewritten in the same style as before. Simplest English, 3rd person, action dialogue driven, no heading, ~500 words, continuing directly from where outline 1 left off, the bread awakening the town. This is another short standalone piece for the chat, same category as the last one, so it belongs inline, not as a file. I'll open already inside a moment. The smell hitting the street and pulling someone in, rather than narrating the setup, and keep dialogue doing the work the exposition did in the original outline. The smell reached Samuel Cole before he understood what it was. He stopped in the middle of the street, his boots frozen mid-step, his sick wife's empty cup still in his hand from the water he had carried her that morning. He sniffed the air again. Warm, sweet, something rising like a memory climbing up out of the ground. "Bread," he whispered to himself, not believing it. He followed the smell, past the general store, past the shuttered blacksmith shop, straight to the door of the Lucky Ram. He stood there a long moment, ashamed of how badly he wanted to walk in. Inside, Greta pulled a loaf from the old oven, her apron dusted white, her face pink from the heat. She turned, and there stood Samuel in the doorway, hat crushed in his hands, looking half like a beggar and half like a man who might turn and run. "Come," Greta said simply, waving him toward the bar. Samuel did not move. "I ain't got coin today, ma'am." Greta was already cutting a thick slice from the warm loaf. She held it out to him anyway. "This is not for coin." He took it slow, like he expected her to snatch it back. Then he bit into it. His eyes went wet almost at once. He turned his face away, embarrassed, but his shoulders shook all the same. "Been 2 days since I ate proper," he admitted, voice rough. Been saving what little we got for my wife." "Then eat," Greta said, "and bring her some too." Word moved through Elk Hollow faster than any wagon could carry it. By midday, more folks stood outside the Lucky Ram, drawn by the smell curling from its chimney, sniffing the air like hungry dogs. Some laughed at themselves for coming. Others simply stood in the doorway, unsure, the way Samuel had been. "Smells like my mother's kitchen," one old woman said, tears rising before she even took a bite. Jonas stood behind his own bar, arms crossed, watching all of it with his mouth slightly open. Men who had not stepped into his saloon in a year were suddenly filling his chairs, not for whiskey, but for his wife's bread. "You did this," he said to Greta that evening, once the ovens had gone cold and the last of the crumbs were swept away. "With flour and fire, nothing more." Greta wiped her hands on her apron, tired but steady. "Whiskey makes a man forget his sorrow for one night," she said. "Bread reminds him why he still wants to live in the morning." Jonas said nothing for a long moment. Outside, the wind still blew through Elk Hollow, same as always. But behind him, for the first time in longer than he could remember, the saloon was full of voices and laughter, and the warm, stubborn smell of hope rising from an oven that would not stay quiet. The user once outlined 3 continued in the same established pattern, simplest English, third person, tilde 500 words, no heading, opening mid-moment with action and dialogue carrying the story. This is the darkest, highest stakes section, winter, hunger, sickness, so the emotional weight needs to land through concrete scenes rather than narration. Same category as the previous 2, short creative writing for the chat, not a file. I'll open already inside the crisis, the oven going cold, or the sickness worsening, and let Greta's decision to give away her starter be the unexpected action beat that continues the pattern from the earlier outlines, even though this section is framed as the story's dramatic testing point. The oven had gone cold 3 days now, and Greta stood staring into it like it had betrayed her. Behind her, Jonas shivered by the window, watching snow pile against the glass so thick it blocked half the light. "How much flour left?" he asked, though he already feared the answer. "Enough for one more loaf," Greta said. "Maybe." Outside, the wind screamed down streets buried in white. Elk Hollow had not seen a wagon in 2 weeks. No flour was coming. No help was coming. A knock came at the door, weak and slow. Jonas opened it to find Samuel Cole standing there. Snow crusted on his shoulders, his face gray with worry. "It's my wife," Samuel said, voice cracking. "She's burning up. Doc says she needs food, real food, or she won't make it through the week." Greta's hands went still on the counter. That night she sat by candlelight, staring at the small clay jar she had carried across the ocean, her grandmother's starter, alive and waiting, needing to be fed to survive. She had guarded it so carefully. Now it seemed foolish to guard anything while people were dying. "Jonas," she said suddenly, "wake up." He blinked at her from his chair. "What is it?" "This starter," Greta said, holding up the jar. "It lives if you feed it. It grows if you share it. One oven cannot save this town in winter, but many ovens." Jonas sat up straight, understanding rising in his tired eyes. Many ovens could. The next morning, despite the biting cold, Greta wrapped herself in every shawl she owned and walked door to door through the snow, carrying small portions of her precious starter in little jars and cloths. She knocked on the Coles' door first. "Feed it flour and water each day," she told Samuel's fevered wife, kneeling by her bed. "Keep it warm near the fire. It will grow. It will feed you." Some neighbors doubted her. An old miner crossed his arms in his doorway and said, "Strange German magic won't stop a Montana winter, ma'am." "It is not magic," Greta answered evenly. "It is patience and sharing." Slowly, reluctantly, smoke began rising from chimney after chimney across town, each home nursing a piece of the same living dough Greta had carried from across the world. Weeks passed. The Cole cabin, once silent with fear, filled again with the smell of baking bread and broth. Dr. Whitfield visited one afternoon and stood in the doorway, stunned, watching Samuel's wife sit up in bed for the first time in days, color returning to her cheeks. "I don't understand it," the old doctor admitted, shaking his head. "Bread and broth, nothing more. And yet—" "Hope needs feeding same as dough does," Greta told him simply. Outside, the snow kept falling, same as it always had. But inside nearly every home in Elk Hollow that winter, something small and stubborn kept rising, refusing, even in the coldest months, to die. The user wants the final installment, outline 4 as the story's ending, matching the established pattern, simplest English, third person, tilde 500 words, no heading, action dialogue driven. This closes the arc that started with a hook and unexpected action. The ending should land the emotional payoff, transformation, gratitude, legacy, through scenes rather than summary, mirroring how the previous 3 sections resolved their tension through moments rather than narration. Same category as before, short creative writing for the chat. I'll open still inside a moment, spring arriving, the town gathering, rather than stepping back to narrate, and let the final beat, the carved words on the sign, land as the closing image, consistent with how the earlier outlines ended on a resonant image rather than a summary statement. Spring came slow, melting the snow drop by drop, until one morning Samuel Cole's wife stepped outside her cabin on her own 2 feet for the first time in months. She stood blinking in the sunlight, thin but alive, her hand pressed to the doorframe for balance. Samuel stood behind her, watching her breathe the fresh air, and he could not speak for a moment. Then he laughed, loud and sudden, startling a bird from the roof. "Look at you," he said, voice thick, "standing there like nothing ever happened." "Something happened," she said softly. "Bread happened." Down the street, the Lucky Ram Saloon looked nothing like the dusty, forgotten place it had been the autumn before. Long wooden tables now filled the room, tables Jonas had built himself through the coldest nights of winter, unable to sleep, needing his hands busy. A small bakery counter stood along one wall, and every morning townsfolk gathered there before the sun had fully risen, drawn by the same warm smell that had once pulled Samuel through its door as a starving, ashamed man. "2 rolls today, Mrs. Bauer," an old widow said, setting down her coins. "Keep your coins," Greta answered, wrapping the rolls in cloth. "Bring me eggs instead if your hens are laying again." The woman smiled and nodded, and shuffled off content. Jonas watched all of it from behind his bar, arms crossed, shaking his head slowly like a man still not quite believing his own eyes. Miners' wives sat beside widowers. Children ran between tables while old men played fiddles late into warm spring evenings. It was noisier, fuller, and more alive than the Lucky Ram had ever been, even in its best years long before hardship struck. One afternoon, a young boy climbed a ladder outside the saloon, paintbrush in hand, touching up the old crooked sign that had read Lucky Ram for so many tired years. Jonas stood below, directing him. "Leave the name," Jonas said, "but add something beneath it." "What words?" the boy asked. Jonas looked to Greta, who stood in the doorway wiping flour from her hands, watching the sunlight fall warm across the street she had once walked into as a frightened, judged stranger. "Where bread saved us all," Jonas said. The boy carved the words carefully into the wood beneath the old sign, and when he climbed down, a small crowd had gathered to see it. Samuel Cole stood among them, his recovered wife leaning against his arm. "Ain't that the truth?" he said, nodding slowly. That evening, as the sun set gold over Elk Hollow, Jonas stood beside Greta on the saloon steps, watching smoke rise gently from a dozen chimneys across town, each one baking bread from a starter she had carried across an ocean and given away without asking for much in return. "I thought I brought you here to share my ruin," Jonas said quietly. Greta took his hand, flour still dusting her fingers. "You brought me here to help this town remember how to rise."